By the time comedians arrive, the PR war is already finished. That is not speculation. It is a pattern that has repeated itself throughout modern celebrity culture so consistently that it effectively operates as a rule. And in the Sussex case, it applies with remarkable accuracy. The moment late-night hosts, stand-up comics, and comedy writers begin treating a public figure as dependable material, as someone whose circumstances generate laughs automatically, without much setup, without the need to carefully construct a punchline because the situation itself has become the punchline, that shift has already happened. Meghan is, of course, a lifelong feminist, which she demonstrated by marrying a prince and quitting her job. Comedians are not creating that judgment. They are reflecting one the public has already reached. They follow audiences rather than lead them. A joke only lands when people already understand what the joke is referring to. What happened to the Sussex brand over the last 2 years, from Netflix rankings that became a recurring source of mockery, to the Spotify departure that generated its own wave of headlines, to a succession of interviews and projects that handed comedians an almost endless supply of ready-made material, is that the public reached a conclusion, and the comedians followed in a predictable sequence. I found out she was looking for a man in England. She wanted wealth, she wanted fame, and she targeted Harry. Tonight, we're examining the moments that shaped that comedic verdict, the remarks that cut the deepest, the ones that traveled the furthest, and the observations that delivered an uncomfortable level of structural precision. Observations that no carefully crafted press release could undo. We're looking at what Jimmy Carr said, what Kelly Osbourne said, what the South Park writers managed to compress into 90 seconds, what Bill Maher noticed from his particular perspective, and what Chris Rock decided to put on a Netflix stage in front of a paying audience that had specifically bought tickets to see him. The purpose is not to amplify criticism or simply pile on. It is to understand what the pattern itself reveals. Because when comments from different people in different settings, across different forms of media all converge around the same basic observation, it tells us something about where the public conversation has settled and why it settled there. Okay. King Charles traveled to the United States to mark the 250th anniversary of American independence from Britain and to negotiate the release of a British hostage being held by an American. Let's begin with the numbers because they provide the context for everything else, and because they remain the piece of evidence that both comedians and commentators return to most often when making their argument. The major Netflix project, the lifestyle series With Love, Meghan, which was intended to demonstrate that the Sussex brand could attract audience interest completely independent of royal controversy, palace drama, or institutional conflict. It debuted in 2025. The concept was simple. Meghan in her kitchen, Meghan with friends, Meghan living the California lifestyle she chose. The platform was Netflix, with access to a global audience numbering in the hundreds of millions. The project was backed by a multi-million-dollar production agreement. The promotional machine behind it was first class. It finished the year ranked 383rd globally on Netflix, not during a particularly bad week. Not because of unusually difficult competition. For the entire year of measurement. Ranked below a 2014 episode of Peaky Blinders that had been available on the platform for more than a decade and had presumably already reached most of its audience. Ranked below a children's animated series called Grizzy and the Lemmings, a show about a bear and a group of small rodents aimed primarily at children between 4 and 7 years old. The title of her show was With Love, Meghan. Love Meghan? For what? To watch? Who wants to watch Meghan Markle bake a pie? Season 2 of With Love, Meghan made even less of an impression. The holiday special finished 1,022nd globally. Harry's polo documentary accumulated approximately 500,000 total views across its entire run on the platform. To understand what those numbers represent commercially, consider this. The 2022 Sussex documentary about leaving the royal family generated 81.6 million viewing hours in its first week alone. Same woman, same platform, different premise. California lifestyle content instead of conflict with the royal institution. And the gap between those figures tells the commercial story of the Sussex brand with remarkable clarity. Everybody wants to be a victim. What's this girl? Meghan Markle? Seemed like a nice lady, just complaining. Didn't she hit the light-skinned lottery and still keep complaining? Acting like she didn't know. Going on Oprah saying, I had no idea how racist they were. It's the royal family. The Netflix agreement was reportedly not renewed under its original terms. The multi-million-dollar arrangement that was expected to prove the Sussex operation could function as a self-sustaining commercial brand, that it could attract an audience based on its own appeal rather than ongoing royal drama, ultimately produced results that much of the industry struggled to describe as anything other than disappointing. And before Netflix, the Spotify partnership had already ended under very similar circumstances. The head of podcast innovation and monetization at Spotify, the executive whose company reportedly signed a $20 million deal, publicly referred to them as grifters on a podcast the very day the contract came to an end. Think about that for a moment. Not a tabloid writer, not a hostile commentator, not an outside critic, the business partner, the man connected to the deal itself. These were the numbers and quotations that comedians already had at their disposal before they ever stepped on stage. Yeah, they were very concerned about their safety, and I understand that part. But after 6 episodes, I wanted to attack them. There was no need to invent material, no need to exaggerate. All they had to do was read the public record back to the audience. If Hollywood today is giving you the complete picture on this story, the commercial results, the specific criticisms, and the recurring patterns emerging across comedians with entirely different audiences, the like button costs nothing, and it helps keep the channel going. Prince William or Prince Harry? Prince William or Prince Harry? Well, the royal family, if you can picture it, are basically our Kardashians. And Prince Harry is very much our Kanye. Laughter. Jimmy Carr's treatment of the Sussex story deserves closer attention, not just because of what he says, but because of how he says it. His delivery style is part of the reason his observations spread as widely as they did. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't perform outrage. He doesn't rely on visible contempt or dramatic disgust. Instead, he delivers even his sharpest remarks in the same measured, flat, almost detached tone he uses for everything else, as if he's casually reading facts from a mildly interesting report rather than commenting on a major public figure. That approach is central to how the joke works. The implication is that the facts themselves are already absurd enough. They don't need embellishment. They don't need performance. He simply presents them in sequence, allows the audience to connect the dots, and then moves on. His most widely shared observation about the Sussexes reduced the entire saga to a single line. This isn't a monarchy anymore. It's a reality show with much better hats. That joke traveled for a reason that goes beyond it simply being funny. It wasn't personal. It was structural. It identified the mechanism at the center of the entire story, the transformation of royal access and royal proximity into commercial content, and expressed it in a way that required no specialist knowledge to understand. Meghan says they'd now like to divide their time between spending your money in the UK and spending your money in Canada. Laughter. The audience already knew exactly what he meant. All he did was describe it plainly and publicly in a way people remembered. Carr also returned repeatedly to what has become perhaps the most enduring comedic target in the entire Sussex narrative, the privacy paradox. Years later, it remains one of the most reliable sources of material. The irony is simple enough to fit into a single sentence. 2 people who publicly announced they wanted a private life, then proceeded to film substantial portions of that private life and distribute the footage commercially to a worldwide audience. They want both things. You can't say, these people were so mean to us, poor us, we don't want all this attention, and then write a book about how much you don't want attention. A whole book about wanting privacy, available wherever books are sold. Bill Maher arrived at essentially the same conclusion completely independently. Different comedian, different audience, different setting, different style. The fact that multiple comedians, working separately and without coordination, continue arriving at the same observation is itself part of the evidence. It suggests the contradiction is obvious rather than manufactured. No spokesperson can fully explain away a contradiction that people can instantly understand. the best available strategy is usually to reframe it. And reframing a contradiction is, in many ways, an acknowledgement that the contradiction exists in the first place. Subscribe to Hollywood Today so you never miss what we cover next. And leave your thoughts in the comments below. Love American television. My brother's fiancée, Miss Meghan Markle, appears on the American show Suits. Wednesdays, 8 p.m., USA Network. Check it out. She's fantastic. Is it? Yeah. The only difference between that show and this one is that people watch this one. Bill Maher approached the same central irony from a distinctly different angle. He is not the same type of comedian as Jimmy Carr. His style is more openly political, more focused on the argument itself than the punchline, and his audience generally expects to be challenged rather than simply entertained. Maher is often less concerned with whether a joke lands perfectly than whether the underlying point is delivered with force. When he made the privacy observation, the book about wanting privacy available wherever books are sold, it functioned more as political commentary than satire. And because of that, it reached a different audience and carried a different kind of influence. It was repeated and circulated by people who may never watch stand-up comedy, but who pay close attention to political commentary. Watch the Harry and Meghan Netflix documentary. I'll be honest. Before I watched it, I wasn't a fan of theirs, but now that I've heard their side of the story, I hate them. When someone with Maher's ideological outlook, not someone easily dismissed as a reactionary royal loyalist, arrives at essentially the same conclusion regarding contradictions in the Sussex public narrative, it becomes much harder to frame the criticism as politically motivated or coming from only one side. The South Park moment approached the subject differently in both tone and style, but it identified a remarkably similar issue and spread with comparable effectiveness. Well, I think some people might say that your Instagram-loving wife doesn't actually want privacy. How dare you, sir? My Instagram-loving wife has always wanted her privacy. And you know what else? To hell with Canada. We're leaving. We'll find somewhere quiet where we can live as normal people. Come on. South Park has a long-established history of locating the essential absurdity within public situations and compressing that absurdity into a few lines of dialogue or a single visual image that then spreads far beyond the episode itself. You don't need to watch the episode. You hear the phrase and instantly understand the joke. That kind of compression is one of the show's most effective cultural skills. And it applied that skill to the Sussex story in a way that produced exactly the outcome South Park is known for. The phrase that emerged from the episode, "far from the paparazzi, but not too far," became an almost perfect 5-word summary of the issue. 5 words that captured the tension between publicly expressing a desire for privacy while simultaneously monetizing public attention. People who had never watched the episode, never seen a South Park clip, and perhaps had little interest in the show itself, encountered the phrase independently on social media or through conversation and immediately understood what it referred to. In California, we're just a normal couple living close to Oprah and far from the paparazzi. Oh. But not too far. That is ultimately the test of whether a satirical phrase reaches its full potential. Not whether audiences consume the original source material, but whether the phrase survives after being detached from it. If it can stand alone and still communicate the entire argument, it has succeeded. That kind of compression makes satire culturally useful during public debates. It provides a shorthand for people who already share a particular interpretation. And once that shorthand enters public circulation, it becomes part of the background framework through which future events are viewed. Every subsequent interview, every announcement, every new project, the phrase no longer needs to be quoted directly. It simply lingers in the audience's mind and influences how the next message is received. John Oliver's involvement is noteworthy for a different reason, because of what his participation indicates about how widely the criticism has spread. Whining, complaining, always saying, "Woe is me," like they're the only people who've ever had problems. Everybody's life is difficult. Oliver is not a conservative commentator. He is not aligned with monarchist traditionalism, nor is he someone whose criticism can easily be explained as loyalty to established institutions. When someone with Oliver's political orientation and audience finds the Sussex narrative too obvious a target to ignore, It suggests that the criticism has moved beyond partisan boundaries. The contradictions are being noticed across a genuinely broad spectrum of viewpoints. Broad enough that it becomes increasingly difficult for Sussex supporters to credibly characterize the entire body of criticism as hostility toward racial justice or nostalgia for Britain's imperial past. Chris Rock approached a different aspect of the story. His material focused more directly on the racial dimension of the Sussex narrative, a topic many comedians had largely avoided because engaging with it carried obvious risks. Meghan Markle was there, huge celebrity. Yeah, you guys love suits. Especially Prince Harry. He treated it like Tinder. The fact that one of the most respected and influential Black comedians in the world chose to make the Sussex story part of his Netflix material was significant in itself, particularly because the performance took place on the same streaming platform whose agreement with the Sussexes had recently ended without being renewed under its original terms. Commentators paid attention not only to what Rock said, but also to where he said it. Comedy stages operate according to their own unwritten rules. What can be said and who says it often matters as much as the content itself. Audience reaction is heavily influenced by the identity of the person delivering the observation. When Chris Rock comments on a narrative that includes questions of race, audiences process that observation differently than if the exact same point had been made by a white British comedian. And that distinction matters, because it influences whether the point contributes to a wider conversation or is immediately categorized as partisan criticism and dismissed. Rock's decision to engage with the subject shifted something in the public discussion. It created a challenge that neither supporters nor critics could easily address directly. The observation carried a different kind of weight, and because of that, it proved unusually difficult for interested parties to respond to effectively. You know who Kate Middleton is? Beautiful woman. Yeah, okay. Great mother. Whenever the kids are being difficult and refusing to go to sleep, she puts on an episode of Suits and they're asleep immediately. Now let's turn to Kelly Osbourne because her contribution to this conversation was fundamentally different from that of the comedians and deserves separate examination. Kelly Osbourne is not a stand-up comic. She does not operate within the framework of a comedy stage, where audiences arrive expecting provocative material and where everyone understands the performer's role from the outset. She is someone who moved within many of the same social circles as the Sussexes. She knew Harry personally, not simply as a tabloid figure or media character. And for precisely that reason, many people would have expected her to be more sympathetic to the Sussex narrative than the average public commentator. She possessed the kind of proximity and insider perspective that usually produces one of two outcomes: either loyal silence or devastatingly specific criticism. She chose the second option. Her central observation was not really constructed as a joke. It was simply a position stated plainly. Everybody's life is hard. The implication was straightforward. That presenting personal hardship as uniquely exceptional and uniquely deserving of continuous public attention is not a sustainable foundation for a public identity, a business strategy, or an ongoing commercial enterprise. She delivered that observation without wrapping it in comedy, and that lack of comedic framing made it harder to dismiss. A punchline allows people to respond by saying they didn't find it funny. A statement about ordinary human experience, delivered by someone who has navigated highly public personal struggles herself, demands a different response. And the Sussex operation never seemed to have an obvious answer. The detail from her commentary that spread most widely was her reference to the Netflix ranking, number 383. She wasn't building toward a punchline. She was presenting an argument supported by evidence. Nothing to deliver, she said. And then came the ranking. In that sequence, the number stopped functioning as an entertainment industry statistic and started functioning as a verdict. The ranking already existed before she mentioned it. What she did was attach meaning to it. Osbourne also addressed the gap between Harry's earlier public history, the aspects of his younger years that remain part of the public record, and that he has, to varying degrees, acknowledged, and the public persona he has cultivated since relocating to California. That newer persona presents a man who has experienced significant personal growth, developed greater self-awareness, and now speaks publicly about mental health, vulnerability, and personal values. Her argument was not that people are incapable of changing. It was that the commercial presentation of that change has become so extensive, so carefully packaged, and so consistently monetized that the packaging itself has become a source of skepticism. Audiences have encountered essentially the same story of personal transformation across interviews, documentaries, podcasts, books, and multiple media formats over several years. And rather than strengthening belief, repetition has produced fatigue. The narrative of growth remains available. What has been missing, in the eyes of many observers, is the kind of measurable change in commercial outcomes that would make the story feel persuasive rather than self-interested. The comparison to Wallis Simpson that appeared throughout broader commentary during this period is also worth examining directly and carefully. Not because the comparison is exact, it isn't, but because its appearance reflects an important shift in how the situation has increasingly been framed historically. And understanding that shift helps explain the foundation on which many of these comedic observations are built. Wallis Simpson was the American divorcee whose relationship with King Edward VIII contributed to his abdication in December 1936. In many historical accounts, and in a significant portion of popular understanding, she became associated with one of the most serious constitutional crises faced by the British monarchy during the 20th century. An American woman, twice divorced, whose relationship with a British king created a situation the institution struggled to accommodate. The comparison with Meghan is obviously imperfect. The historical period is different. The circumstances are different. The institutional environment is different. And the relationships themselves differ in important ways. Yet the comparison emerged in mainstream commentary, not merely in tabloid headlines. And when a historical parallel begins appearing at that level, it tells us something about how the current story is being interpreted and narrated. Jimmy Carr referenced Wallis Simpson in a particularly specific way. He wasn't simply he traded one authority structure for another. It wasn't framed as a condemnation, it was framed as an observation. But it was a pointed observation, and it resonated because it put words to something many people had already been thinking without fully articulating. One small but interesting detail separates Carr's material about Harry from much of the rest of his Sussex commentary, and it is something a number of viewers of his specials have noticed. Whenever William enters the discussion, the tone shifts. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, the sharpness softens. The comedian who spends several minutes delivering precise and often cutting observations about one brother suddenly pauses to tell a warm, relatable story about the other. A human moment, a brief anecdote, then he moves on. That imbalance functions as a form of commentary in its own right, and it does not appear accidental. What ties all of these moments together? Carr's reality show comparison, Maher's privacy contradiction, South Park's 5-word summary, Osbourne's nothing-to-deliver observation, and Rock's decision to address the subject on a Netflix stage, is that each arrived at essentially the same structural contradiction from a completely different direction. Different comedians, different countries, different audiences, different political leanings, some conservative, some liberal, some black, some white, some British, some American. Yet they repeatedly arrived at the same conclusion. The platform was real, the resources were real, the opportunity was extraordinary, and the results, at least publicly, are what they are. Comedy generally functions less as an engine of public opinion and more as a reflection of it. Comedians rarely create a public judgment. More often, they identify it, refine it, and package it into a form people can easily repeat. When the entire spectrum of comedy, from Jimmy Carr's polished Netflix special to Bill Maher's politically focused commentary, from South Park's animated satire to Kelly Osbourne's podcast remarks, keeps arriving at the same place through genuinely different routes, something noteworthy is happening. They are not collectively constructing a case. They are independently reporting on a conclusion that much of the public had already reached before any of them stepped onto a stage. The audience formed its judgment. The comedians followed afterward, and changing that judgment is unlikely to come from a better spokesperson or a more carefully managed interview. What changes it is a different outcome, a commercial success significant enough that the number 383 no longer becomes the statistic everyone remembers. A project compelling enough that audiences engage with it because they genuinely want to watch it, rather than because of the Sussex name attached to it. A contribution substantial enough that comparisons between what was achieved and what could have been achieved with the available resources no longer feel so stark. None of that is impossible. The opportunity has not disappeared. The window remains open. It is simply work that has yet to be completed. And the space between the resources available and the results delivered continues to be where comedians find their material. The platform still exists. The recognition still exists. And although the institutional connection has weakened, it has not vanished entirely. Some of the proximity that made the operation commercially viable in the first place remains. Those are genuine assets. But assets only matter when they produce outcomes. And in this particular environment, effectiveness means creating something capable of standing on its own merits, something that attracts an audience because of the content itself, rather than because of a royal adjacent association, something that delivers a commercial result strong enough that comedians begin looking elsewhere for material. Until that happens, comedians will continue doing what they have been doing. They will read the public record back to audiences in that calm, measured voice. And audiences will continue recognizing exactly what is being read. So what do you think would actually change the public conversation surrounding the Sussex brand at this stage? A major commercial breakthrough? A significant personal transformation? Something genuinely new and unexpected? Or do you think comedians will continue finding reliable material here for years to come? And which comedian, in your view, came closest to identifying the real heart of the story while using the fewest words to do it? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to Hollywood Today so you never miss what we cover next. And if you enjoy this kind of analysis, the like button helps keep the channel going. King, a lazy comparison for the sake of a joke. He was asking a more pointed question. How does a grown man, a prince, a military veteran, someone with decades of institutional experience, arrive at a position where his decisions appear to be shaped so heavily by the influence of a single individual? Carr offered his own explanation, that Harry spent much of his adult life having major decisions structured by the monarchy and its expectations. And when he left that institution behind, he did not necessarily arrive at the independence he described as his objective. Instead, he transferred that same organizing influence elsewhere. The structure changed, but the pattern, Carr suggested, remained largely the same.